Thatcher Hale was 17 years old when they called him a thief. Shunned by his own family and cast out with nothing but a frayed canvas sack, no money, and nowhere to go. He trudged silently into the autumn woods, as darkness slowly closed in around him. The only things truly accompanying him were a small carved owl in his pocket, a dog pacing quietly at his heels, and a silence that had been growing in him for years. He kept walking, leaving behind the only home he had ever known, completely unaware that far beyond the northern hills, the first deadly storm of winter was already gathering strength. Black Alder Crossing sat far enough north that winter often arrived before people finished talking about autumn. The settlement was small, a few cabins, a smithy, a trading shed. Most families spent more time preparing for cold weather than celebrating good harvests. Thatcher had grown up there under the protection of his father, Isaac Hale, a respected teamster whose word carried weight throughout the valley. But that stability shattered 18 months earlier, when a falling cottonwood crushed Isaac's wagon during a river crossing. After that, only one man seemed interested in what became of the boy. Thaddeus Crow, an aging trapper who lived near the frozen marshes west of town, noticed things others overlooked. While neighbors called Thatcher quiet, Thaddeus saw someone paying attention. He pulled the boy out of his grief with the hard lessons of the wilderness. Thaddeus taught him how to read the wind by watching the treetops, how fresh snow concealed the land's hidden traps, how standing deadwood burned far hotter than green timber, and how a good windbreak could save a life much better than a roaring fire. One fading afternoon, he pressed a small, hand-carved owl into Thatcher's palm. "Some folks look at a tree and see nothing but firewood," the old trapper said softly. "Others see a place to survive the winter." It would be his final lesson. The following winter, the bitter northern cold quietly took Thaddeus away, stripping Thatcher of the only anchor he had left. Thatcher kept the wooden owl. Years later, he still carried it in his pocket. Ever since then, his isolation only deepened. But in truth, that loneliness had taken root the day Isaac died. From the moment his father was gone, the Hale cabin had essentially died right along with him. It ceased to be a home. It became nothing more than a hollow shell trapping people who were merely tolerating each other. Isaac's death had sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. Small disagreements began to fester. The silences grew suffocating. But the heaviest burden of all was the gaze of Eleanor, his stepmother. The older Thatcher got, the more he looked exactly like Isaac. Yet ironically, the boy's presence didn't soothe Eleanor's grief. Instead, it acted as a jagged blade, constantly carving into her bitterness. His quiet nature and habit of wandering alone only widened the chasm between them. Into that powder keg of resentment, the missing silver bracelet was the final spark. It was Isaac's most priceless keepsake. His name was engraved on the inside band, worn smooth by the years before Eleanor guarded it like a sacred relic. The morning it vanished, the widow's reason evaporated right along with her panic. By mid-afternoon, years of suppressed anger and suspicion were aimed squarely at Thatcher. When he denied taking it, his words did nothing to slow her fury. Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes narrowing into cold slits, and delivered a blow that stripped the 17-year-old of whatever dignity he had left. "Looking like your father doesn't make you half the man he was." The room fell dead silent. No evidence surfaced. No witness stepped forward. It didn't matter. The verdict had been delivered. To escape the suffocating aftermath of the argument, Thatcher retreated behind the shed to split firewood. Late that afternoon, Thatcher returned from splitting firewood behind the shed and found a canvas sack waiting beside the front door. Someone had already packed it. Inside rested a half-loaf of bread, a wool sweater, and an old belt knife that had once belonged to Isaac. The sight of it told him more than any conversation could have. The decision had already been made. Eleanor stood near the stove but never met his eyes. Nobody argued. Nobody offered another explanation. The cabin felt strangely smaller than it had that morning. Thatcher slipped the knife into the sack, lifted it onto one shoulder, and stepped outside. Behind him, the door closed with a dull wooden thud. Ahead lay the timberland stretching toward the northern hills. His dog, Bracken, trotted after him without hesitation. Thatcher kept walking. He never looked back. The first 3 days belonged to the creek. Thatcher followed the narrow ribbon of water deeper into the wilderness. Knowing that streams solved one problem no traveler could ignore, water meant life, it also offered a guide through unfamiliar country. During daylight, he moved steadily. A few mouthfuls of bread kept hunger at bay. Bracken ranged ahead, sometimes disappearing among the trees, before returning a few minutes later. When darkness arrived, Thatcher searched for shelter beneath dense pines where the lowest branches nearly touched the ground. Thaddeus Crow had taught him that a good windbreak could preserve more warmth than a careless fire. So he never lit one. Smoke carried stories farther than footsteps. The nights tested that decision. Cold crept through the forest after sunset. Thin snow appeared across shaded ground. Distant wolves announced themselves from somewhere beyond the ridges. Once, a sharp crack echoed through the darkness when a frozen branch finally surrendered to its own weight. Each sound seemed larger after midnight. Thatcher slept lightly with Isaac's knife close at hand. The third night proved the hardest. Temperatures dropped lower than before, and frost formed along the edge of his blanket. Sometime before dawn, Bracken pressed against his back, sharing what little warmth the dog could offer. Neither moved much until daylight returned. When the sun finally reached the treetops, both were still there, cold, tired, hungry, alive. By the morning of the fourth day, the last of the bread was gone. A dusting of early snow covered the forest floor, settling in the shadows beneath spruce and pine, while patches of brown earth still showed through in the open. Winter had not fully arrived, but it was close enough to leave its signature across the landscape. Until then, Thatcher had been moving with only one goal in mind, putting distance between himself and Black Alder Crossing. That was no longer enough. A man could not wander forever and expect to survive a northern winter. Late that morning, Bracken stopped beside a narrow game trail and lowered his nose to the ground. The dog followed a scent for several yards before circling toward a shallow depression hidden between two ridges. Thatcher studied the area. Deer tracks crossed the snow. Rabbit prints disappeared beneath a cluster of brush. More importantly, the hollow sat below the strongest winds and showed signs that animals used it regularly. The sight stirred a memory. Years earlier, Thaddeus Crow had pointed toward a bedding area much like this one and shared a lesson Thatcher never forgot. If you're looking for a place to survive the winter, don't start with the trees. Start with the animals. They've been solving that problem longer than we have. Bracken continued moving through the depression, pausing now and then to investigate fresh scents. For the first time since leaving home, Thatcher stopped thinking about where he had come from. His attention shifted toward something else entirely. The forest was no longer a road leading away from his past. It was becoming a place where a future might be built. And then the tracks led them into older country. The creek gradually disappeared behind a maze of ridges and timber. The ground became rougher. Wind-carved outcrops rose from the hillsides, and scattered patches of snow lingered in every shaded hollow. Shortly after midday, Bracken suddenly broke away from the game trail. The dog bounded across a narrow stretch of open ground and vanished behind a cluster of young aspens. When Thatcher caught up, he stopped. A giant cottonwood stood before him. At some point decades earlier, the tree had died without falling. Its massive trunk still rose toward the gray sky, weathered by countless seasons. The base measured nearly 13 feet across, thicker than any tree Thatcher had ever seen. More surprising was the opening. A dark entrance gaped along the southern side of the trunk, facing away from the prevailing winter winds. Bracken had already disappeared inside. Thatcher approached carefully, one hand resting on the handle of Isaac's knife. The entrance was tall enough to walk through without bending. Cold air moved around the outside of the tree, yet almost none reached the interior. He stepped into the darkness. The space inside was astonishing. The hollow chamber stretched far beyond what the exterior suggested. Dry wood formed the walls. A small crack high above allowed a faint shaft of daylight to filter downward. The floor sat well above the surrounding ground and showed little sign of standing water. Most people would have seen a dead tree. Thatcher saw something different. Shelter from the wind, protection from snow, a chance. For the first time since leaving Black Alder Crossing, a thought entered his mind and refused to leave. He might actually survive the winter. The cottonwood offered potential, nothing more. A hollow tree could become a shelter, but it could just as easily become a cold grave if the work stopped too soon. Thatcher spent the next several days changing that. Using a broad piece of bark as a shovel, he cleared years of leaves, rotten wood, and loose debris from the interior. Anything dry enough to burn went into one pile. Everything else was dragged outside and spread around the base of the tree where it could no longer steal space from the living area. Once the floor was exposed, he covered the dampest sections with layers of dry grass and shredded bark. A sleeping area took shape along the rear wall, away from the entrance. Nearby, he stacked firewood in neat rows and marked out a separate corner for food, tools, and supplies. The work was repetitive. Each improvement made the hollow tree feel less like a hiding place and more like a home. During one trip outside, Thatcher carried back a charred board left behind by an old lightning strike. Using a piece of charcoal, he began marking observations on a flat plank, salvaged from a fallen cottonwood limb. Temperature, weather, firewood, anything that might matter later. The habit came from watching Isaac keep freight records and from listening to Thaddeus explain that memory often failed when winter lasted too long. Late that evening, after finishing the day's work, Thatcher studied the rough shelter around him. Then he wrote two simple words across the top of the board. Day 1. The entry was small. The decision behind it was not. From that moment forward, he was no longer drifting through the wilderness. He was building something meant to last. Several days later, while clearing the last section of the interior floor, Thatcher noticed something unusual. Most of the ground inside the cottonwood consisted of compacted soil mixed with old fragments of decayed wood. His makeshift bark shovel moved through it easily. Then it struck something solid. The sound stopped him immediately. It wasn't the dull scrape of a root. It wasn't the sharp crack of stone. A hollow echo rose from beneath the floor. Thatcher knelt and brushed away the loose dirt with his hands. Gradually, the outline of a square flagstone emerged from the earth. It looked too regular to be natural. Curiosity replaced fatigue. He dug around the edges, worked the stone loose, then lifted with both hands. Beneath it lay a narrow cavity hidden in the darkness. Then his fingers reached down and touched oilcloth. Something had been waiting there for a very long time. Thatcher carried the bundle toward the entrance where daylight was strongest. The oilcloth felt stiff with age but remained intact. When he carefully untied the leather cord, 4 items appeared inside. 11 silver coins, a well-made trapper's knife, a weathered notebook, and a folded letter. The handwriting on the outside had faded, but several words remained clear. To whoever finds this. Thatcher unfolded the paper. The writer introduced himself as Jeremiah Boone. Decades earlier, he had spent 2 winters living inside the same cottonwood while trapping the northern valleys. Age and illness had eventually forced him to leave. Before doing so, he buried the items beneath the floor. The letter surprised Thatcher. Most of it wasn't about money. It wasn't about valuables. Jeremiah spent far more time discussing mistakes. A poor chimney design that nearly filled the hollow with smoke. Food spoiled because it had been stored too close to the ground. A woodpile that became useless after heavy snowfall buried it. Each lesson had been paid for with hardship. Near the end of the letter, one passage stood apart from the rest. If you're reading this, winter is probably trying to kill you the same way it once tried to kill me. The silver may help for a little while. The notes will help much longer. Thatcher lowered the letter and opened the notebook. Its pages contained measurements, observations, weather records, sketches, and practical solutions collected across 2 brutal winters. For the second time in his life, someone he barely knew had chosen to invest in his future. The silver had value. The knowledge was worth far more. The first pages of Jeremiah Boone's notebook contained an unexpected warning. They said very little about trapping, almost nothing about hunting. Food appeared later. Smoke came first. Jeremiah described a mistake from his first winter inside the cottonwood. He had built a small heating fire, convinced the hollow trunk would naturally draw smoke upward. Instead, the air current reversed. Smoke collected beneath the ceiling. By the time he realized the danger, he could barely stand. The story unsettled Thatcher enough to act immediately. Using clay from a nearby creek bank and several flat stones, he built a small hearth against one side of the hollow. Jeremiah's sketches provided measurements and general placement. The design seemed straightforward. The first test proved otherwise. For several minutes the fire burned normally. Then gray smoke stopped rising. It rolled back into the chamber. Within moments the interior filled with a choking haze. Bracken began coughing. The dog staggered toward the entrance, blinking and wheezing. Thatcher grabbed him and rushed outside. They remained there long after the fire died. Cold air slowly cleared their lungs while Thatcher studied the cottonwood. Something was wrong. Hours later, after comparing the hollow's shape to Jeremiah's drawings, he finally noticed the difference. His smoke outlet sat too low inside the trunk. Air pressure trapped the draft instead of encouraging it upward. The lesson was impossible to ignore. A shelter could protect a man from winter. Built carelessly, it could kill him long before the cold ever had a chance. 2 days later, Thatcher turned his attention to the entrance. The opening faced away from the worst winter winds, but it remained far too exposed. Using young willow shoots gathered along a frozen creek bank, he wove a thick door panel and lashed it together with twisted roots. At first glance it looked solid. Strong enough. Finished. Then the mountains offered their opinion. A hard wind arrived during the night and funneled through the narrow depressions surrounding the cottonwood. Sometime before dawn, a violent gust tore the woven panel loose and hurled it several yards across the snow. By morning, drifting snow had invaded the hollow. Half the firewood stack sat buried beneath ice and powder. Thatcher stood silently in the entrance, studying the damage. Later that day, he found a passage in Jeremiah's notebook that seemed written specifically for that moment. The wind always finds what the eye forgets. The second door took longer. Wooden stakes anchored the frame into the ground. Deer-hide lashings replaced the weaker root bindings. A simple locking bar secured the panel from inside. Nothing about the redesign looked impressive. That wasn't the point. Winter rarely punished large mistakes first. More often, it slipped through the smallest weakness and widened it until the entire system failed. As Thatcher uncovered the frozen woodpile and rebuilt the entrance, he began to understand exactly what Jeremiah meant. The improvements did not transform the cottonwood overnight. Small adjustments accumulated over time. The smoke draft finally worked as intended. Cold air no longer slipped through every corner of the entrance. The sleeping area stayed dry even after several days of freezing weather. That was when Thatcher began paying closer attention to numbers. Each morning and evening, he added new marks to the wooden record board. Outside temperature, firewood consumed, food remaining. The entries slowly filled the plank. Patterns emerged. A surprising one appeared after only a few weeks. The hollow cottonwood held warmth far better than he expected. Once the fire established a bed of coals, the interior cooled much more slowly than the open shelters he had used during his first nights in the wilderness. Even more important, a bundle of wood lasted nearly twice as long as his original estimates. Jeremiah Boone's notes had not exaggerated. The old trapper had measured the same thing years earlier. Late one evening, Thatcher studied the growing collection of charcoal marks. For the first time since leaving Black Alder Crossing, a faint smile crossed his face. The figures on the board were telling a simple story. The system was working. By mid-January, the valley changed in a way Thatcher did not like. At first, the difference seemed insignificant. No fresh snow arrived. The wind weakened. Several days passed beneath a sky the color of dull iron. Then the silence began. Rabbit tracks became scarce. Deer movement dropped sharply. Even the crows that normally drifted across the ridges each morning seemed to vanish. The forest felt empty. Bracken noticed it too. The dog frequently stopped whatever he was doing and lifted his nose toward the northern horizon. Sometimes he stood motionless for several minutes before returning to the cottonwood. The behavior reminded Thatcher of lessons learned beside Thaddeus Crow years earlier. Animals often sensed major weather shifts before people recognized them. The old trapper had trusted those warnings. So did Thatcher. One evening, after finishing his chores, he opened Jeremiah Boone's notebook and reread the final pages describing a blizzard from decades earlier. Many of the signs matched. The unusual calm, the disappearing birds, the strange heaviness in the air. Outside, the forest remained quiet. Far too quiet. As darkness settled across the valley, Thatcher closed the notebook and stared toward the entrance of the hollow tree. Something large was gathering beyond the mountains. Winter was not finished with him yet. Thatcher understood something the notebook repeated several times. Warmth alone could not carry a man through winter. A heated shelter without food was simply a wooden box where starvation happened more comfortably. With the signs of a major storm growing stronger, he began working on 3 problems at once. The first involved trapping, using flexible willow branches, old deer hide strips, and twisted roots gathered from the creek bank. He built a series of simple snares. Rabbit trails crossing the sagebrush received the most attention. Small deadfall traps appeared near places where squirrels and ground-feeding birds searched for seeds. Bracken proved useful in ways Thatcher had never expected. The dog frequently paused beside packed sections of snow where animals traveled repeatedly. More than once, those locations became successful trap sites. The first rabbit provided little meat. It provided something more valuable: experience. Thatcher learned how to clean it efficiently. The meat was smoked over a low fire. Fat went into an old tin container salvaged from debris near the creek. The hide was stretched and dried, eventually serving as extra insulation around the sleeping area and along several troublesome drafts near the entrance. Food reserves slowly improved. Then he turned his attention to supplies he could not produce himself. One section of Jeremiah Boone's notebook mentioned a small trading post tucked along a freight route almost 2 days away on foot. If the coming storm trapped him in the valley, reaching it later would become impossible. Before leaving, Thatcher returned the bundle to its hidden cavity beneath the floor. 9 silver coins stayed there. He carried only 2. The journey consumed nearly 4 days. At the trading post, the shopkeeper barely glanced at him. A teenage boy traveling with a dog was not unusual in frontier country. The man simply assumed Thatcher belonged to a trapper working the northern ridges. The silver purchased flour, salt, dried beans, cheap coffee grounds, matches, a steel needle, and waxed thread. Nothing luxurious, everything useful. By the time Thatcher returned to the cottonwood, the sun was sinking behind the western hills. That night, new entries appeared on the record board. Flour, approximately 18 days if rationed carefully. Beans, 12 meals. Rabbit meat, ongoing requirement. Firewood, the true limit on all cooking. The following days disappeared into steady labor. He reinforced the door again. Improved the hearth. Sealed remaining drafts. Deepened a drainage channel near the entrance. Raised the food platform farther from the floor. Outside, Bracken dragged small branches toward the tree whenever Thatcher gathered wood. The dog had no understanding of winter planning. He was simply following the example set by the only companion he had left. As darkness settled over the valley, Thatcher stood at the entrance and looked across the snow-covered timber. When he had first discovered the hollow cottonwood, it had been a place to hide. Now it was something else, a home worth defending. The blizzard arrived during the night. One moment the valley lay beneath an uneasy silence. The next, the mountains disappeared. Wind slammed into the cottonwood with a deep, continuous roar that sounded less like weather and more like a freight train crossing the sky. Snow followed immediately, Fine crystals forced their way into every exposed corner before the storm thickened into a solid wall of white. By dawn, visibility had vanished. The ridges were gone. The trees were gone. Even the nearest landmarks beyond the entrance had dissolved into swirling gray. Throughout the first day, Thatcher focused on routine. Firewood moved from the storage pile to the hearth. Meals were prepared carefully. Measurements continued on the record board. Every few hours he checked the door, the draft channel, and the smoke outlet. The second day brought stronger winds. The cottonwood groaned occasionally under the pressure. Snow accumulated against the entrance faster than Thatcher could clear it. Each time he opened the door, loose powder poured inward like dry sand. Outside no longer felt like a place. It felt like an obstacle. By the third day, the storm dominated everything. The world beyond the hollow tree ceased to exist. Life narrowed to a handful of essential things. A fire that needed tending. A woodpile that could not be wasted. Food that had to last. A dog sleeping near the warmth of the coals. Hour after hour, the wind continued its assault. Toward evening, Thatcher pushed open the entrance just enough to inspect the conditions outside. The sight stopped him. Snow had climbed almost to the top of the doorway. Only a narrow opening remained between the storm and the shelter. For the first time since the blizzard began, he felt the full weight of what he was facing. Winter had not come to test the cottonwood. It had come to bury it. The fourth night nearly ended everything. The storm had been battering the valley for days. Wind hammered the cottonwood without rest. Snow continued piling against the entrance until the lower half of the shelter seemed buried inside a frozen hillside. Then something broke. A sharp crack echoed through the hollow. Thatcher sat upright instantly. One side of the door had torn free from its wooden hinge supports. A blast of air exploded into the chamber. The fire bent sideways. Loose snow scattered across the floor. Within minutes, the temperature began dropping. There was no time to wait for daylight. Grabbing a lantern and Jeremiah's trapper knife, Thatcher forced his way toward the entrance. Every gust fought him. Snow poured through the opening while the damaged panels shuddered violently against the remaining fastenings. Bracken moved beside him, then settled directly against the gap where the wind entered. The dog stayed there, hour after hour, while Thatcher worked. His hands quickly lost feeling. Deer-hide lashings stiffened with ice. More than once, the knife slipped and sliced across his knuckles. Blood mixed with snow before freezing against his skin. Still he kept going. A new anchor stake was driven deeper into the ground. Additional braces reinforced the frame from inside. Fresh hide straps replaced the damaged connections. Every lesson learned since finding the cottonwood returned at once. The draft had to hold. The structure had to hold. The door had to hold. Outside, the blizzard continued raging through the darkness. Inside, the repairs slowly took shape. Near dawn, Thatcher finally stepped back and watched the entrance for several minutes. Nothing moved. The braces remained firm. The lashings stayed tight. Cold air still leaked through tiny cracks. But the violent rush of wind was gone. The system had survived. Bracken remained beside the repaired section until daylight reached the narrow opening above. Neither the boy nor the dog celebrated. They simply sat beside the fire and listened. For the first time in many hours, the storm was losing. The wind stopped on the sixth day. Not gradually, not reluctantly. It simply ended. Thatcher noticed the silence before he noticed anything else. For nearly a week, the blizzard had filled every hour with noise. The absence of it felt almost unnatural. He waited another hour before approaching the entrance. Then he pushed against the door. Snow resisted at first. A second shove broke through the drift. Cold sunlight spilled into the hollow. Outside, the valley looked transformed. The forest had disappeared beneath a vast blanket of white. Snow stood shoulder high in some places. Several large pines lay scattered across the hillsides where the storm had finally overpowered them. Broken branches littered the landscape. Fresh scars marked the ridges. The blizzard had left its judgment everywhere, yet the cottonwood remained standing. Thatcher slowly circled the tree, inspecting the entrance, the drainage channel, the supports, and the repaired door. Damage existed, but nothing critical had failed. When he returned inside, his eyes settled on the record board. Charcoal marks covered much of the surface now. Wood consumption, food stores, temperature observations, storm notes, predictions, actual results. The numbers matched more closely than he expected. That realization stayed with him for a long moment. Jeremiah Boone had not defeated the blizzard. Thaddeus Crowe had not defeated it either. Neither man had ever possessed that kind of power. What survived was something far more dependable. Careful observation, practical knowledge, methods tested against reality. The storm had delivered its verdict, and the principles they passed down had endured. Spring arrived slowly in the northern valleys. Snow lingered in shaded places. Ice still clung to creek banks each morning, yet the long grip of winter had finally begun to loosen. One afternoon, a thin column of smoke rose above the timber and drifted across the ridge. Several miles away, Jed Mercer noticed it. The veteran trapper had spent more than 40 years traveling mountain country. Smoke in late winter was nothing unusual. Smoke coming from the middle of an isolated forest was another matter entirely. Curiosity led him toward it. By late afternoon he reached the cottonwood. Thatcher saw the stranger before the stranger saw him. A gray-bearded man emerged from the trees leading a pack mule. He stopped several yards away and quietly studied the shelter. The inspection lasted longer than Thatcher expected. Jed examined the entrance first, then the reinforced windbreak, then the drainage trench. His attention moved to the stacked firewood. After that, he noticed the smoke outlet, and finally the weathered board covered in charcoal records. The old trapper stepped closer. Without asking permission, he spent several minutes reading the measurements, temperatures, wood consumption, food inventory, storm observations. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed. Most people would have been impressed that a 17-year-old boy had survived the winter alone. That was not what captured Jed's attention. He had seen lucky survivors before. Luck rarely produced records. Luck did not build systems. Luck did not leave evidence. His eyes settled on Jeremiah Boone's knife hanging near the entrance, then on the board, then on Thatcher. A faint smile appeared beneath the old trapper's beard. "You didn't make it through winter because you got lucky," he said. His gaze drifted toward the cottonwood standing behind them. "You made it through because you paid attention." For the first time since leaving Black Alder Crossing, someone was looking at Thatcher and seeing exactly what he had become. Spring brought more than warmer weather. It brought people. Over the following weeks, Jed Mercer stopped by several times. Sometimes he arrived alone. Other times he brought a fellow trapper, a homesteader from a neighboring valley, or a traveler passing through the mountains. Each visitor seemed to leave with the same impression. The cottonwood was interesting. The young man living inside it was even more interesting. Word spread quietly. Not the kind of story that filled newspapers. The kind exchanged beside campfires and trading counters. A 17-year-old had survived the worst blizzard in 15 years by turning a hollow tree into a functioning winter shelter. Most people came expecting to see luck. They left talking about preparation. One afternoon, Jed arrived with his sister, Martha Mercer. She was a widow who lived on a small homestead south of the ridge. Before leaving, she handed Thatcher a folded patchwork quilt stitched from pieces of worn work shirts, flour sacks, and old blankets. Nothing about it was expensive. Everything about it carried care. For a long moment, Thatcher simply held it. Several days later, he gave her something in return. A small wooden owl carved from cottonwood, the same kind of gift Thaddeus Crowe had once given him. Martha turned it over in her hands and smiled without saying much. Some things did not require explanation. As spring continued unfolding across the valley, Thatcher occasionally found himself thinking about Black Alder Crossing, about Isaac, about Eleanor. The anger that had once followed those thoughts no longer carried the same weight. Winter had changed too many things. The woman who sent him away had unknowingly placed him on a different path. Thaddeus Crowe had provided the knowledge to begin walking it. Jeremiah Boone had left behind the hard-earned lessons to continue it. Then nature delivered the final examination. The results spoke for themselves. One evening, Thatcher sat outside the cottonwood while the last snow patches melted beneath the trees. Bracken rested nearby, watching the valley as a soft breeze moved through the new leaves overhead. The old hollow tree still stood exactly where it had stood before. The difference was the young man sitting beside it. Some people are called thieves because others never take the time to understand them. Some places are dismissed as worthless until hardship reveals their true value. And sometimes a person does not discover where he belongs until life forces him to leave the place he once called home.